Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the 401 Access Denied podcast brought to you by Delinea. I'm the host of the episode, Joe Carson, Chief Security Scientist and Advisory CISO. It's a pleasure to be here with you, always bringing thought leadership, educational topics to really keep you ahead of today's threats that target organizations and even your family and your social sphere as well. So I'm always looking for a really kind of intelligent, really smart guest, and I've got an awesome guest for you today. So Gal, welcome to the podcast and episode for today. You want to give the audience a little bit of a background about yourself, how you get into the industry, what you do, and some interesting things about yourself.
Cool. So thank you for having me. Let's see how I got into the industry. So back when we were still using modems and VBSs, I got into hacking and things like that. And one thing led to another. Started being one of those kids that rode taxis in the 90s to work at software companies. And this is how I got into the industry and kept doing that for many years. Funded 4 startups, 3 of those sold. The last one to Delinea, which is how we got to work together, which is great.
Absolutely, which is a great. It's always great that acquisitions bring people together.
Yeah. And my previous startups, one went to the area of cyber and fintech, and the other became part of Palo Alto Networks, where I ran the endpoint products and things that later became known as XDR.
Yep.
So lots of fun. I did also a lot of research for Intel in the areas of security research and AI a little bit, also in Palo. And so my expertise is sort of broken up between AI research and cybersecurity research.
One of the big topics we're here to talk about today is around the identity threat landscape. It's evolving so fast. It's becoming a major challenge for organizations to make sure they're able to have visibility, to manage identities, to put the right security practices in place. I think it's one of the most kind of sometimes not prioritized high enough for many organizations. And when they do it, then it's a long journey to really get the right success and best practices. One of the things is, where did identity threat landscape, what did identity threats really start off with? When it comes to my mind, it kind of really comes down to, I think really in the 90s, a lot of it came around about, stealing and compromising passwords. For you, where did it really start for you when it comes to identity theft and identity threats?
So I think that what you say is a very good way to look at it. I would also think about Active Directory threats, and those started even LDAP earlier in certain senses, and how we saw different threats and attempts to manipulate those directories and those users in order to take over accounts or lateral move between accounts across those environments.
Absolutely. So one of the things I've seen, when I'm doing a lot of incident response and looking at, uncovering incidents and really understanding it by let's say, the attack path and the initial attack vectors, a lot of it comes down to compromising identities. We look at the Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report, which I analyze every year. A large portion of most of the incidents have some type of identity compromised. And to your point, I think one of the things when I look at those attack paths, you always see some type of Active Directory services compromised, whether being stealing an existing user's identity and using that to do reconnaissance and find out what's on the network and find out what types of solutions and products and tools they're using, or ways to elevate, ways to laterally move. Or they create, adding their own users, and sometimes just kind of getting that persistence, because sometimes they have the fear that the user that they've compromised, that maybe at some point they might change the password or they might change the security. So they're always looking ways to make sure they've got a foothold and gaining access. What's some of the kind of common techniques that you find attackers using to compromise identities? What's some of the most common that you see?
So we've actually in the Linear Labs, we've started researching in depth these type of situations. We've found that there is a certain shift or increase in a trend that was already existing before, of attackers starting to look more for ways to steal identities that bypass MFA. So Usually up to today, it was fairly easy. You would go with credential stuffing. I got to use a password, but that's no longer enough in a lot of cases, right? Because organizations have become more and more aware of MFA, and the prime targets usually have MFA in a lot of places. Now, this is not always the situation, as was with the recent Snowflake hacks.
Mhm.
But what we've seen is as the attackers shift in that direction, we see in criminal underground forums discussions about attacker in the middle tactics, browser in the middle tactics, and another one is info stealers. But
Mhm.
a lot of info stealers started publishing that they are focusing on extracting live session cookies for common identity services.
Mhm.
So again, the targeting is how do I get into your identity system as one of your users, as you said earlier.
Absolutely. And that's once they get the initial foothold or that initial kind of patient zero or account zero, it really allows them to understand more about your internal workings of an organization, about who that person's connected to, what services and what applications that the organization is using, what security controls in place. Sometimes, unfortunately, for many organizations, when they get past that initial front door security, there is no more security inside. And that's one of the things is that organizations are starting to look at how to make sure that you've got security at every interaction and defense in depth scenarios, the layered approach. What's some of the things that you find the best practices that makes it difficult? Let's say, you talked about MFA as well. I've seen a lot of attackers using things like social engineering or even, using generative AI to have a conversation to try and bypass a lot of those controls, improving phishing techniques. So what works? What's the best practices to make it as difficult as possible?
So I think it's a long list to go through all of them, I'm sure, but it starts from getting the right MFA solution. So not all MFA solutions were born equal, and I think a lot of people don't think about that. But not all MFA solutions were born equal. So if you have a phone or SMS-based solution, those are not good enough. What you need to go with MFA solutions that are strong and resilient to phishing. So FIDO compliant type of keys, but not necessarily keys, and phishing resistant MFA is really important to put in place because it uses a lot of the threats that we were talking about earlier, and also the phishing and social engineering threats that we were just discussing. Second is actually figuring out that you have everybody under MFA, because it's always everybody except the CEO and the IT admin. But those are the guys that really need it. Another funny anecdote that we had is we got to a company where the CEO really wanted to have all possible factors applied in his Okta on his account. Now, what it ended with, they had a policy that you need 2 factors to log in. But he had both SMS and phone message call enabled. So basically, if you stole his number by doing line jacking, you could literally log into his account without any password or username required.
So simply the two methods that require you use simply just cloning the phone.
Yeah.
The cloning the number would allow you to get access because both of those factors go to the same destination.
Yeah. So it's funny to think about it, but with the good intent, you got the wrong result, right?
Yeah.
So it's very important to think about that and to make sure that you have at least one FIDO compliant MFA. But enough about MFA, I guess. There are also other very important best practices. So one is there are 2 main levels to this. One is controlling access to your privileged identities. And this sounds simple, but it's actually hard, right? You need to understand who are these privileged identities. You need to continuously monitor when there are new ones, and you need to control access to them and ensure that it's done in a safe and managed way. And then, so this is one level. And then the next level that is really critical to actually protect yourself from identity threats is that you have to monitor all of those. So you have to monitor your identity environment, your identity configuration, changes to the identity configuration, attacks on identities. And I'll give you an example here. For example, there was a successful credential stuffing attack on one of the MGM employees, IT employees, that was blocked by MFA in the MGM attack that literally suspended the entire resort, right? After that attack was successful, nobody was actually monitoring this. So nobody knew that somebody actually did a credential stuffing attack, successfully logged in into one of the accounts, and got blocked by MFA. And the attackers had like weeks to learn about this guy and then do social engineering attack to get the IT support to disable his MFA. So monitoring is really critical. If you're not aware of a threat, you will never be able to prevent it. And this is where identity threat detection comes in. And I know I'm sort of talking about what my company used to do and still does as part of the Linea, but this is effectively something that if you don't do, if you don't see, you can't actually protect yourself from anything.
Absolutely. It's one of the things I'm always saying is that we want to make it as difficult as we can for attackers, but we also want to have the visibility of when attackers are actually using techniques. And if you can see the techniques, I would say it's like looking at a lake, and that lake basically is clear, it's still, and you want to be able to see the ripples. And if you don't investigate what those ripples are, you're not going to be able to uncover those compromises attempts. And if they go unchecked and let's say monitored, what will happen is the attacker will then find another way. They will keep using the techniques that work, but they will look for ways to get around to controls that actually stop them in the first place. And I think that's one of the important things is that, it's sometimes it's after every incident, you can go back and you can look at the logs and you go, oh my goodness, there was so much noise, but just no one was paying attention. No one was, trying to learn about these attacks and then put more controls in place or more visibility to make sure that if they tried again, are we continuing to prevent the attack rather than just hoping the controls are working and not having the visibility. So I agree, identity threat detection response, you need to make sure you're actively learning from the attacks that's targeting your organization and making sure you're strengthening the controls and getting into more, I refer to as a bit more adaptive or dynamic types of access control. And that allows you to continually evolving and not just hoping that the static controls you put, in place 6 months ago or a year ago are still effective.
Yeah, I'm totally with you. One of the key points of having identity threat detection and response is the response part. And the response is, I detected something, I need to respond to it by actually shifting this knowledge about the threat, the current threat, into my active defenses. So I now have the ability to say, this is a source of attack, I will block even if they are successful, right? And then however great you are as an attacker, you will just not be able to log in, even if you got the right username and password. So,
absolutely. And one of the things you find is that, when you've got enough deterrence in place, the attacker will basically, they will not want to waste their time and money and resources. For them, it's a business in many cases. And time for them is money. And if they're not being successful using the time they've got, they're going to look for another target, an alternative organization, victim that may not have those controls in place. So that means is, putting more time and more cost to the actually attacker is definitely a big deterrent because then they will look for alternative victims.
Yeah, I sometimes joke that you don't need to be the fastest to survive being chased by a lion. You just need not to be last.
Yes, that's sometimes, yeah. So the bear story as well, fits in. You just make sure you're just ahead of the next person. When it gets into, we talked a little bit about the attacks and side of things. What types of attacks we're seeing? Is it personal identifiable information that's being the most targeted? Is it credit card information, health information? Which are some of the most kind of highest target value assets that attackers are going after?
So I think we've seen already when we've talked about this earlier, monetization is always the prime motive for attacks. And we see different patterns emerging periodically as trends are changing, right? So, for example, there was a period that bad people realized that stealing images from beauty clinics and plastic surgery clinics is a very good way to blackmail. That was a trend that we saw like 8-9 months ago, I think, maybe longer. But now it's down because I guess it outlived its usefulness.
Another type of extortion, which we're seeing extortion kind of even
Yeah.
overtake traditional ransomware, is becoming one of the top methods.
Yeah, and ransomware is always evolving. It always works because it's extortion of an organization with lots of money and lots of resources. So ransomware is never dying down. We've seen that Ransom Hub has really started taking a huge percentage of the ransom market. Market is a funny way to refer to it. I don't think people are buying out of their own free will, right? But they still get it, the product. So those are some of the trends that we're seeing. Other trends are reselling information. So even if you get a ransomware attack or something like that, it's not just the ransomware. The PII, the information about usernames, passwords, everything is resellable. And it's being resold on the dark web. Basically, there are sites that allow you to currently actively on a malicious online forum. There is like credentials into company apps, service Y, and you can literally click on it and say, I want to try it. And you get like to see a preview that the system logs in for you and checks the credential for you. So it's crazy the level of customer service that is offered by these malicious actors.
Absolutely, you're right. It is a market. It's a criminal economy, which is set up of a supply chain economy where you've got those who specialize in initial access. All they do is get credentials, validate them, sell them onwards to other criminals, and you've got the ransomware creators, or the the malware creators who are creating kind of multi-headed, multi-threaded, different techniques, whether it being credentials stealing, data stealing types of attacks, or even just being able to find backdoors as well within unpatched systems. So really looking at the creators of the malware. Then you've got the help desk. You've got those who just specialize in providing services to help the victims pay the cryptocurrency, or you've got the to be able to restore the data from recovering it. So you've got this whole ecosystem that are all working together. And I've even seen the latest evolution of ransomware data extortion, where they started using generative AI to analyze, because in the past, they got huge dumps of data. They didn't know what they had. And it might take them a long time to analyze. How much can this organization pay? Are they doing anything potentially criminal? What type of value of the data do they have? And now they're using generative AI to analyze the data at extreme, acceleration than they would have done. Even within minutes, they're able to understand, here's the value of the data. Here's the type of access credentials we might have. Here's the type of PI data. Here's the value that can be made. Here's the types of criminal activities you can do with that data. So the acceleration speed that they're able to analyze large amounts of data is it's really scary to this point, how fast it can be monetized and then put on the dark web as a service, that they can actually see that these credentials work, and here's the type of privileges that entitlements that credential has. So we've been mostly talking about the threats. What about misconfigurations? Because that's another big area. Because when I look at a lot of I think about 3-4 years ago, one of the Verizon data breach investigation report had misconfigurations as one of the top causes. And we do say that a lot of that was the acceleration of digital transformation to cloud and so forth.
Yeah. And
if we look at a lot of the recent data breaches, they were not from attackers; they were from misconfigurations of cloud storages. So what about that? How do we make sure organizations are finding those and discovering them before security researchers or attackers find them, to make sure that data has not been compromised? What's the best practices for finding and discovering misconfigurations?
So I think nowadays we see 3 main categories of solutions that help you deal with misconfigurations. So there are CSPMs, which are now fairly common, that help you deal with cloud misconfigurations. There are SSPMs, DSPMs. In my opinion, they are both the same category, just playing arguing with each other that help you with specifications in general and configurations there. And there is identity security posture management, which I think is the most neglected because everybody can easily claim that they do something like finding your stale accounts. It's relatively easy. Even SSPMs and CSPMs can do it. But there are other misconfigurations that you can't find like this. Misconfigurations that are related to your SAML configuration or scheme configuration or the way you set up the rules in your identity provider and so on. And we see that pretty much no customer that we visit 100% pass rate on the misconfiguration checks that we have built, for example, in our product. Far from it. Even if we start with customers that usually have less than 50% pass rate. And there are a lot of techniques around utilizing misconfigurations to attack. One of the things that is important to understand is the entire identity system is like a router. It's a router that transfers identities from one node to the next node. And whatever the router before you tells you is the identity of that entity, the next node in the graph is trusting implicitly. So let's say I have an Active Directory that is connected to an Okta that is connected to Salesforce. Keep it simple, let's stop at 3. So whatever Active Directory tells Okta, Okta trusts. So if Active Directory tells Okta that I'm Gal, I'm Gal. Now if somebody misconfigured Okta and decided to tell Salesforce that I'm Joe, then I'm Joe in Salesforce. And for intensive purposes, Salesforce has no way to distinguish between me and you at that point. We will appear exactly the same in every log that will exist in Salesforce except our IP. And even our IP, if we are slightly smarter, can look the same, right?
Yeah, you can fake your IP address and MAC address quite easily.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think that's one of the common things I've seen, especially in multi-cloud and hybrid cloud and SaaS, is where organizations are becoming very heavily relying on APIs, and those APIs are what basically allowing those systems to communicate. And to your point, if you're able to manipulate or let's say poison or infiltrate one API communication, then the downward systems have no way of telling who the original source was, because they've already been able to bypass that initial vector. So I think it's one of the, at least from this year and last year, I've seen lots of talks at different conferences. So, talking about the multi-cloud and the API scenario, and how critical it is. And we're seeing a lot of kind of areas where organizations are looking to try and minimize that where possible.
Yeah.
And discover the misconfigurations as well, because if you don't have a way of detecting it, and I've also seen where, especially in that multi-hybrid cloud, you might have one system where you're configuring the security controls and policies and entitlements here, and then you've got some skim or synchronization that's hoping it gets replicated here. And let's say somebody leaves the organization and it gets configured here, but that synchronization doesn't happen. They still have access over here. That account is never ever deprovisioned. It's only a matter of time before an attacker finds it. And you might be looking over here at your dashboard and your configuration, and it might tell you that everything is correct. But you need to validate. You need to make sure that account that you removed, that you deprovisioned, that has meant to be no longer active, has been properly decommissioned. I think that's one of the biggest challenges many organizations are facing is getting that visibility of that continuous synchronization.
I have an interesting story on what you just described. We got to a customer after it was breached, and they had their applications syncing from Okta to the downstream applications using Scheme. And the attacker wanted to maintain access to a certain application. I won't say which one because of customer privacy, because it's really very specific. But the interesting thing is the attacker wanted to maintain persistence. So they created a high privileged local account in the end system, and they disabled the Scheme sync. between the Okta and that system. So that account would never be disabled. But nobody actually noticed because the regular login still worked. So when they thought they cleaned up everything, they didn't know that that account still existed as a local account that you could log in interactively, not through Okta, on that application.
I see that quite often, and sometimes it's the time as well that those things happen. That the minimizing that window of opportunity as well the challenge. Where's the future going? Where do you see? We've seen a lot of evolution and innovation around AI, both the defensive and the offensive side of things. We've seen the advancements in things like deepfakes when it comes to stealing identities and impersonating. Where people have Zoom backgrounds. We've got fake people walking around and doing business email compromise. For you, where do you see the future going in the identity threat landscape? Which technologies and solutions will help us, or which ones should we be worried about?
I think it's always technology is not good or bad. It's the way you apply it. It's not. I'm not blaming technology or AI. If we call it AI, I'd prefer calling it machine learning, but whatever.
For me, I'm in the same where I call it augmented intelligence, assisted intelligence, advanced intelligence. It's the different terminologies, but really what the value comes from is the large language models and the machine learning.
Yes.
So the natural language processing and understanding has probably changed the field significantly. So the terminology is always confusing because we put, just like cyber, we put everything under this massive umbrella, and we're doing the same with AI, even though when you uncover it, it's a scheduled task, or it's an algorithm that's basically not evolving. It's got a fixed data set. So it's always important to understand that people really get to understand what is behind the algorithm, what's kind of really running the decision making.
Yeah. So if we go back to what's going to happen, so I think in terms of AI in attacks, we already see AI used extensively in phishing. We see much more customized phishing written for this specific user, for this specific company, with publicly available information that was scraped about that person even. So all of these attacks are evolving, obviously. The second area that you already mentioned is deepfakes. And we know at least about one deepfake attack that got a bank in Dubai to send $20 million out. We know it is largely suspected that the social engineering attack in the MGM attack that we were talking about was done through deepfake of the voice of that person. Arguably, it could be a voice actor, but one of the two probably happened there. And we'll never know unless they will be caught and tell us the true story.
Sounds like an episode of Darknet Diaries in the future.
Cool. And so this is one trend. And this is on the attack side, right? And we also will see more autonomous attack systems. So less a person trying to manage it, but more an LLM, AI, agent, whatever we'll call it, working in the background and automating the responses, which means times will be cut shorter in terms of how much time we have to defend and respond to an event in most cases.
Absolutely. Myself and Miko talked about this at the beginning of the year, or as it's the attack, the battle of the algorithms.
Yes.
It's who can process it the fastest, the defense or the offensive, and that's what really will come down to whether being a victim or not.
So I think it's the speed of processing, but it's also to a certain extent the intelligence and the quality of the models. And this is this battle that might have the defenders at some advantage, finally, in something in cyber. But it's a costly advantage, as we all know. On the defense side, I think context is becoming the king. It always has been the king of everything. I see it more and more. You have to have identity context in your security decisions. If my antivirus is trying to decide if a PowerShell script makes sense or not, it doesn't know who I am what I do in the organization, what's my endpoint supposed to be used for, and what is the context of my other tasks, what I've been doing all around. Even the next
The governance, yeah, the governance and entitlements is, well, have you been doing this in the past? Is it part of your job?
Yes.
As
Is it part of your job is one of the key elements, right?
absolutely.
And we'll see this starting to come into solutions. We ourselves have started adding this in some of the ways we process data or analyze sessions. And this creates a huge advantage in the ability to actually defend, because the attacker has to do something abnormal for the user.
Yeah.
If you understand the user and the role, you have a much better chance to say, hey, this PowerShell script doesn't make sense because this guy is the CEO, and honestly, CEOs don't run PowerShell on their devices.
What are they running command lines for, or opening up even, terminals?
Yes.
It's not a common practice, and, you can go back, and of course, not every executive might be the same. You might get some techies who, and looking back at their history and their analytics and governance entitlements, you might find some that, have been doing that. But if it's the first time, you might want to question and do more security control checks to verify.
Yeah. And I think it's fine. If it's the first time they get disrupted, they will have to...
better learning and educating the model so that it actually is more intelligent the next time it runs.
Yeah, and obviously this is one of the nice things. Models can get also local context. So in my organization, my CEO really likes to log into AWS. It's silly. I don't recommend it, but if you work in this type of organization, you will be able to configure it, right?
Yeah, you can teach it, and then make sure that the right controls, the context is being validated, verified. Authentication authorization is actually being properly processed and controlled. So with this industry, it's always evolving, and even for myself, doing so much reading just to stay up to date. So conferences, talks, webinars, reading books, audiobooks. There's so much things coming in to say, how do you? What's the way that you stay up to date? What's some of the resources you use to help you, kind of stay educated?
So I would say there is Twitter, and there is other networks that allow you to sort of follow. I like InfoSec Exchange on the Mastodon servers, which is a good one for staying up to date with industry news. You have to follow also some news channels. Everybody finds their own, I think. And I also am really into Telegram recently. I found that there are quite a few useful Telegram channels and more close communities, which are generally better curated and with less noise. So Telegram and WhatsApp communities for that are really useful, in my opinion.
Absolutely. I think it really comes down to that's what I heavily use as well, is the social sphere and community around me. And, there's so many smart people out there that, dedicate and specialize in certain areas. And they've been a huge value and resource to me over the years. So absolutely, the community is amazing, but it's getting out there and making sure you follow the right people and find out the things of interest. So Gal, it's been fantastic having you on the show. I really look forward. Hopefully we'll be able to, every period of time, for the audience to give them a bit of an update into some of the threats that's happening, some of the most notable data breaches and incidents when it comes down to identity threats. So it's been fantastic having you on. If the audience or anyone wants to reach out, what's the best way to contact you if they have any follow-up questions?
Ping me on Twitter or LinkedIn. That's the best place.
The best source. Okay, we'll make sure we get the links in the show notes. So Gal, it's been fantastic having you on, and for the audience, hopefully this has been educational and very informative, and that you've got a bit of an insights into some of the kind of evolution of identity-based threats, some of the techniques that attackers are using, best practices, solutions, ideas, some of the evolving techniques, as well as what to expect in the future. So Gal, it's been fantastic having you on, and for the audience, This is the 401 Access Denied podcast brought to you by Delinea. Tune in every 2 weeks where we bring you thought-provoking leadership ideas, educational episodes to keep you safe and your organization safe from the threats out there. Thank you. Take care and stay safe.
Thanks for having me.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.